This is Theology Bits with Pastor Ben, a ministry of Central Lutheran Church, Eugene, Oregon. This video continues our series Continuity and Change in the Old Testament, with our focus now on the rise of a king. This will be focusing primarily on the book of 1 Samuel. And this text and this passage moves us because if you recall, we just had in this Deuetronomistic history that began all the way back in Joshua and Judges, they were not a nation, they were a people group. And they had a distinctive theology that looked something like this. There was God, there was Israel. Anything that tied those two things together was Torah, what was received on Sinai. But then, how this was played out was that, well, what do you do with Torah? Well, there's two models. You can obey Torah, and you can disobey Torah. There's things you ought to do, things you ought not to do. Well, in this model, if you obeyed Torah, then you would have success, or what in Deuteronomy is called blessings. If you did not, then you would look forward to failure, or what in Deuteronomy are called curses. And we talked about the way in which this is structured in land. What is these blessings? What are these successes? Well, they are the very land that they hold. Are you holding this space that God has promised you, or are you losing it? If you're following God, you're having success and you're holding it. If you're not following God, not following Torah, then you are failing and then you are losing the land. We talked about this, especially with the rise of the judges, and some people might be uncomfortable with this kind of seemingly like prosperity theology, but everything is about here. When do we prosper? When do we suffer? And why? This was the fundamental question. How come this was happening in this way? Well, one thing about this that we didn't talk about is Israel as a group is either following Torah or not following Torah. It was a collective identity. They all together are moving in one way or another. And so we have this kind of litmus test approach to religion. Well, how are we doing with relationship to God? Well, it's not that hard. Are we succeeding or are we failing? If we're failing, we need to go look back at, well, what is it we were supposed to be doing? If we're succeeding, then we are doing something right. Let's go look back at how do we replicate this. That was a general approach for how they could understand themselves together. And you'll remember that they are in this period, more like a people group, and it was the Ark of the Covenant that was what unified them, the worship center. Which is why in the period of the Judges, the judge was as much a religious as a political leader. And this Ark of the Covenant was such an important aspect to their identity that, in fact, when they would go into battle, because you remember this was all about land, were they succeeding or failing politically was in battle with those around them, they would bring the Ark with them. And the Ark was seen as that which united our community and that it was God going with them into battle. Again, not something that you may be 100% comfortable with, but this is very much the theology in the book of Joshua, Judges, and First Kings, and through Second Kings. Well, there becomes a challenge. That is, we talked last time about the problem with the judges is they were one off. When there was this leader, the leader convinced the collective people to obey the Torah. They did, they would succeed, the judge would die. And then they had no leader, and inevitably they would fail. They would not follow Torah, and then they would be cursed and lose the land, and then they'd cry out and they'd repent and they'd change it. And it just, this cycle, we had this several stage, just endless cycle where there is no stability, and they wanted something different. And so they kept trying to make some of the children of judges the next judges, as if to say, we kind of want something that looks hereditary. So for example, Eli had two sons who they really wanted them to be the new judges, and in fact gave them that space, and his sons, named Hophni and Phinehas, went and took the ark into battle, but didn't do it properly. And not only were they killed, they lost the ark. It was captured by the Philistines, which is to say, now how can we be unified as a group? How can we be a people group at all? We don't even have the worship center. And so they were really desperate. They said something needs to change. And then Eli's sons turn out not to be the next judge, but then the last judge does arrive by the name of Samuel. And then what happens? Of course, it's the same thing. They start following God under Samuel. Things start to get better. They do get the ark back. But then what happens? They try to get his sons to be the new judges, and they don't. They turn out not to be good candidates for this. And so what do the people do? And this is where they have a significant problem. This is not just about people being disobedient, but they finally say, this political structure isn't working. And in 1 Samuel chapter 8, there is a revolution in the Deuetronomistic history. We're calling for a king. And what they want out of the king is, they say, we need to be a nation like those around us, and specifically those Philistines who are such a problem for them. We need to be a nation like everyone else. And this is not seen positively by Samuel or by God in the narrative. That is, I'm not sure you want everything about being a nation. We'll explore that, but Samuel says, well, if they do that, then they uses the words, they are rejecting God as their king. If you remember all the way back, what made them a people when they left out of slavery, out of Egypt, was that they were a people of God. That was the whole idea, a people of God. Well, now, are you rejecting that? Are you wanting to be a nation like all the other nations? You're not a people of God anymore? Well, Samuel warns them, if you do this, if you decide to have a king, three things are going to happen. One, there's going to be a draft. A draft not just in the military, but also a draft of people that the king is going to forcibly do work for him. Secondly, what we would call taxes. Neither of these words are there, but that's what the case is. That the king is going to take 1/10 of all that you create. And then the third is, eventually this is going to be oppression. And in fact, it uses the words, he's going to enslave you. I think, trying to remind you, there was a thing like this. It was called a pharaoh back in Egypt. Well, and then it finally says, and when that happens, when that third one happens, you'll cry out to God, like you used to always do in this process, but now God won't answer. Now, there's a reason for that. It's not just because God's being mean here. It's because, remember this model. The whole idea of this model was its flexibility. All the nation of Israel had to do in order to start succeeding with crying out to God, you didn't need to cry out to God. You just needed to observe Torah. And if you observe Torah, then, hey, success was on its way. And it was a very fluid situation where there was the possibility of improvement at all times. Also the possibility of struggling and pain at all times. But now something's different. You've introduced something here, haven't you? A king. Well, what's happened? There has become an intermediary. Because after all, how do you decide whether you collectively are going to be following Torah? Well, before it was what's collectively, what everybody's doing. Now what is it? Well, it's what the king says you're going to do. You now have laws, just like all the other nations, of how you have to behave. And even if you, the people of Israel, cry out to God that we have not been following Torah and we want to, well, it doesn't matter because the king doesn't let you change in that manner. You are stuck with whatever the king wants to do. Now, in real life, there's going to be good kings and bad kings, and that's going to have the two sides. On the one hand, if you have a good king, then you're going to follow Torah whether you want to or not. But if you have a bad one, even if you, Israel, are following Torah, if the king isn't, you're all going to experience the curses and the failure. This is where you'll cry out to God and God won't answer. You see, this is what is going on. Well, believe it or not, the people aren't miffed by this at all because they want everything that comes with being a nation. They say, we need to be able to deal with international affairs, and particularly these Philistines who are around them, in a way that others do. We have no centralized government. We have no centralized unity as a people. We are 12 separate tribes. Well, the king is going to provide that unity. And this is where I always call this a tragedy because, in fact, they did need that. They did need the unity. The ark failed in doing this in practical life. There was a continual problem that as soon as that judge died, then it would say people would go do what was right in their own eyes and they would all lapse. And so you really did need something different. And so they finally come to, well, we've been trying to come with a hereditary title. We may as well call it what it is. It's a king. And so we will have the first king arise, Saul. Now, Saul is an interesting character because he is very much the political leader and he is called upon for a task: deal with the Philistines. And it is true that he does unite all 12 tribes into one government. But then as soon as this starts, it goes south. And the reason is because Saul is now a king, but Samuel, the last judge, is still alive. And Samuel is going to be the religious leader. Well, there's a problem. If Saul is supposed to unite all 12 tribes, how did they ever unite the tribes before? Well, it wasn't through this guy. It was through the religious worship center. So now Saul is trying to lead a united kingdom for something he has no ability to address. And as soon as he's coronated, this happens. Saul is coronated. Samuel coronates him. Hey, here's a king. And then at the coronation, there is to be a sacrifice. The problem is Samuel wasn't there. And Samuel's the religious leader. Samuel's got to do this sacrifice. But he's not there. And so Saul waits a week, and then finally, Saul just goes ahead and does the sacrifice himself. This turns out to be, you have abrogated the order that God has provided. You dared take on this religious leadership role, which wasn't yours to have. You were supposed to just be the political leader. Well, later on, it gets worse. He does not perform a full haram, which is when you conquer an area, you were supposed to destroy everything. And instead, he holds back some of the flocks. And why does he do it? So he can offer a sacrifice once again. And so we eventually get to the point where it says, and the Spirit of God left Saul. So what's happened is there has been something that is very unusual. You want to be a nation, but are you a people of God? Is that what unites you? Or is what unites you now just that you have a king who makes you a united group? Have you lost that fundamental identity? And the king, in this case Saul, is saying, well, it doesn't have to be one or the other, but to do that, then you're going to have the political and religious united, and here they are not. And as a result, I suggest Saul is set up to fail deliberately to show things aren't going well. This kingship isn't going to really work. It does unite you, but at what cost? Now, again, I mentioned when you have the right king, this can go well, but then this is the problem we see from the very start. There are major challenges. Next time, we'll look at the rise of David and what happens when there is a correct king and how there can be later some kind of shift from the religious to the political as being united. But for now, we see the difference in what it is to be a nation and a religiosity structured around being a nation rather than simply being a people of God, where politics is now an element that could, in theory, exist without religion. This is setting us up for how different they were in ways of being religious to their God. This has been Theology Bits. I'm Pastor Ben.